All right. Now that we've looked at context, we now want to begin to dive into the text. And so we want to ask the question, or what this is about is, what was God saying through the human author to the original audience as it relates to both the content, what was said and how it was said, and theology about God and humanity, both fallen and redeemed of the passage. And so we want to keep in mind, again, that we were not the original recipients of this letter, of this passage that we're reading. And so we want to keep in mind that this was written by God through a particular person at a particular time and to a particular people in a particular location, a particular culture, going through a particular situation, usually. And so we want to keep that in mind. And in light of that, we are reading somebody else's mail. Now, we know that Scripture is living and active and sharper than a two-edged sword, that it's meant to be taught to us as well. And so we're going to talk through that in future videos. But the first thing I want to be very, very careful of here is that we are reading the scriptures written to somebody else. And we're trying as best as we can to understand what they were going through and what the original author was seeking to communicate to them. First thing that we want to think through, let me just walk through all of these as to where we're going over the next number of videos, but we want to think through how is God saying what he was saying. That's the video we're going to look at today, which is essentially the question of genre. What was being said then is the question of observation. How do we observe what's happening in the passage? What was being emphasized really is the question of structure. How was the author using structure to be able to emphasize certain things in the passage? What was being taught then is the question of theology about God and people. And then we want to think through how to check our work using commentaries and other resources. And so as we think through genre, how was God saying what he was saying? We would all say that we know enough to know that we're not going to read a newspaper article, or who gets a newspaper anymore, right? Who's going to say that we read an article, news article, even on our phones, the same way that we're going to read a love letter written to us, or the same way we're going to read a novel, all right, like Harry Potter. And so we know that we're going to read different types of genres, different ways. But when it comes to the scriptures, oftentimes we kind of ignore that. And oftentimes we employ the same types of methods to one genre that we do to another genre. And then we get stuck and we don't necessarily understand exactly what's being said. And so we want to be careful to understand that when we come to a passage, we understand what kind of genre it is, and then begin to use the tools appropriate for that genre. And so here's the different genres that the main genres that make up the scriptures. Okay, so letters or epistles, these are our New Testament, like Paul wrote his epistles, and Peter and John, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And so we want to those make up only just 10% of our whole Bible, which is ironic because the majority of us spend the majority of our time just reading those. We cut our teeth in how to do Bible study in these epistles, right? But they're only 10% of the entire Bible, just a fraction of what all that God wanted to say to us. History or narrative makes up a pretty good chunk of our Bibles. Okay, so these are the story parts of our Bible. And I'm not including in here the Gospels, which is majority of narrative, though, as well. But I'm just including those, the historical or narrative books that are in the Bible at 31%. Poetry and wisdom makes up about 20%. God wrote songs to his people, right? God, through the human author, was writing songs and poetry and wisdom literature to his people, right? It makes up 20% of the canon of Scripture. The law, we think of the last half of Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, makes up about 10% of our Bible. Gospels, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of a form of history or narrative, but it's different and unique in some ways. So I keep it as its own genre over here, and it makes up about 7% of our canon. And then prophetic and apocalyptic genre makes up about 22%. And I would say this is a little scary to think about, but in my Bible, and I'd probably say the same for yours, I'd guess the same for yours too, you could look at the page numbers of all the prophetic books, Isaiah on through the Old Testament, and they are about the exact same number of pages as my entire New Testament. But talk about a neglected portion of our scriptures is the prophetic and apocalyptic genre. And that's not including Revelation. That would also be included in apocalyptic literature. And so these are the different genres. And so we want to think through, how do we read these different genres when we come to the scriptures? Now, in the remaining videos, the examples that I'm going to use are going to come from the epistles, an epistle, and a couple from history or narrative, just so that we get a little bit of an idea on how to read a chunk of our scripture. Next video, we're going to think through then what was being said or how to do observations.